Christmas morning arrived quietly. I opened my eyes not to sunlight spilling through the window, not to voices in the next room, and not to the familiar sounds that used to fill this house years ago. Instead, the first thing I saw was the dull glow of my phone screen lighting up the dark kitchen. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe. The refrigerator hummed softly, the heater clicked on and off. That was it, no footsteps, no laughter. No music playing in the background the way it used to when my children were younger and Christmas felt like a shared experience instead of a reminder of what had been lost. I reached for my phone out of habit more than desire. My fingers already knew where to go: Instagram, Facebook. One swipe led to another, and suddenly my screen was full of smiling faces. There they were, my family, my children. My grandchildren, they were gathered around a long dining table, pressed shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in matching pajamas like something pulled straight from a holiday advertisement. The lighting was warm, the smiles effortless. Someone held up a glass of champagne, someone else leaned in to kiss a grandchild's cheek. Wrapping paper covered the floor, plates were full. Everyone looked exactly where they belonged, except me. I was 71 years old, sitting alone in my kitchen, 3 miles away from that table. 3 miles might as well have been 3,000. I stood up slowly, feeling the familiar stiffness in my knees, and poured myself a cup of coffee. The silence followed me like a shadow. I made scrambled eggs because they were easy, because cooking for one doesn't require much thought. I ate standing at the counter, the fork scraping lightly against the plate. Every sound felt louder when there was nothing else to compete with it. No music played, no phone rang, no one knocked on the door. There was no "Merry Christmas, Mom," no hug, no moment where the day officially began. Just another quiet morning disguised as a holiday. This was not something new or shocking. There was no sudden realization or dramatic moment where it all hit me at once. It was simply familiar, too familiar. I had lived versions of this same morning many times before. For 12 years, holidays had looked like this. I learned to wake up without expectations. I learned not to set the table for more than one. I learned to tell myself that people were busy, that life moved on, that families changed. Some days I believed it. Other days, like this one, it felt like a lie I repeated to survive the silence. My name is Claire. I am 71 years old. I raised my children. I showed up to school events. I hosted dinners. I remembered birthdays. I built traditions that once filled this house with noise and warmth. I never imagined that I would become someone who existed on the edge of family photos instead of inside them. What hurt the most was not the distance. It was not even the loneliness by itself. It was the feeling of being forgotten while still being alive, of watching life continue without you, knowing your place used to be there, knowing nothing physically stopped you from being included. People assume this kind of thing happens suddenly. That one big argument or one dramatic mistake pushes families apart. That was not my story. No doors were slammed. No harsh words were exchanged. I did not disappear overnight. It happened slowly, quietly, one holiday at a time. And to understand how I ended up spending Christmas morning alone in my kitchen, staring at other people's happiness through a screen, you have to understand where it really began. Because families do not break all at once. They fracture in moments that seem small at the time. The day my husband died was not the day my family disappeared. That came later. But it was the day the foundation of my life cracked in a way that never fully healed. My husband's name was Robert. We were married for 43 years. That is not just a number. That is a lifetime of shared routines, private jokes, quiet understandings, and plans that never needed to be spoken out loud. He was the person who knew how I took my coffee, who noticed when I was tired before I admitted it, who made ordinary days feel steady simply by being there. When he passed away, everything changed at once, even though the world outside kept moving as if nothing had happened. People say you eventually move on. I have never liked that phrase. You do not move on from losing someone you built your life around. You adjust. You learn how to function with a constant ache that never fully leaves. You learn how to breathe differently because the air itself feels heavier. In the months after Robert's death, the house felt wrong, too quiet, too large. I would catch myself turning to say something to him, only to remember that there was no one there. Nights were the hardest. Mornings came too early. Grief does not follow a schedule, and it certainly does not care about your plans. 8 months later, Thanksgiving approached. I remember looking at the calendar and assuming, without even questioning it, that I would be surrounded by family. That seemed obvious to me. I was newly widowed, still learning how to exist without my husband, and holidays had always been about being together. That was how we had done it for decades. My daughter Jessica had always been the organizer. She managed the group chats, coordinated meals, and made sure everyone knew where to be and when. I trusted that if something was happening, she would let me know. 2 days before Thanksgiving, I sent her a simple message. What time should I come? What can I bring? I waited. Hours passed. I checked my phone more than I want to admit. Eventually, 6 hours later, her response appeared. Oh, Mom, we're keeping it small this year, just us and Tom's family. You understand, right? You probably want a quiet day anyway. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. A quiet day. Since Robert's death, every day had been quiet. Too quiet, silence had become my constant companion, and it was not comforting. It was suffocating. The idea that I would want more of it felt like a misunderstanding so deep I did not know how to correct it, but I did not argue. I typed back, of course, sweetheart, enjoy your day. Those words were polite, they were calm, they were completely dishonest. That Thanksgiving, I sat alone at my kitchen table and ate a turkey sandwich because it felt wrong to cook a full meal for one person. I turned on the television and watched old movies I had already seen dozens of times. I told myself that the tightness in my chest was indigestion. I told myself I was being overly sensitive. I told myself it was just one holiday and things would go back to normal. I believed those things because the alternative was too painful to face. What I did not realize then was that this moment was not a misunderstanding. It was a shift, a quiet one, but a permanent one. The assumption that I would always be included had been replaced with the assumption that I would be fine on my own. No one asked me how I was coping. No one asked if I wanted company. No one questioned whether I might need my family more than ever. They decided for me. That decision, made casually and without malice, changed everything. I did not confront anyone. I did not express my hurt. I swallowed it and told myself that families go through phases, that grief makes people awkward, that things would correct themselves over time. But grief does not make people closer by default. If anything, it exposes gaps that were already there. That Thanksgiving planted a quiet truth in my mind, even if I refused to name it at the time. My presence was no longer essential. I was no longer a central part of the picture. I had become optional, and once someone becomes optional, it is very easy for them to be left out again. That was the beginning. Not the end, but the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself year after year, each time making it harder to speak up and easier for everyone else to assume I was fine. I was not fine. I was grieving my husband, and slowly, without anyone noticing, I was beginning to grieve my family too. That Thanksgiving was not an isolated moment. At the time, I convinced myself it was temporary, the result of poor timing or awkward grief. I told myself families adjust, people get busy, and nothing truly important had changed. Looking back now, I can see it clearly for what it was. It was the first repetition of something that would quietly become routine. Christmas came next. The family group chat became active in early December. Messages appeared throughout the day. Plans were discussed. Dinner times were suggested. Gift exchanges were debated. Someone mentioned matching pajamas. Photos of decorations were shared. Everyone seemed involved, engaged, and excited. I read every message. I noticed something right away, even if I did not want to admit it to myself. No one spoke to me directly. No one asked whether I was coming. No one mentioned my name in connection with any plan. I waited, assuming someone would eventually clarify where I fit into all of it. Days passed. By December 23rd, the uncertainty became too heavy to ignore. I picked up the phone and called Jessica. I tried to keep my voice light, as if this were a small detail instead of something that had been bothering me for weeks. Honey, I said, what time is Christmas dinner? There was a pause on the other end of the line, not the kind caused by a bad connection, but the kind that comes when someone is choosing their words carefully. Then she said, Mom, didn't David tell you? We did Christmas Eve this year. It already happened last night. We figured you might want to rest. I did not respond right away. They had celebrated Christmas without me. They had gathered. They had opened gifts. They had taken photos. They had used the family china that once belonged to my husband's parents. All of it had happened while I sat alone in my house, unaware that I had already missed it. No one had called. No one had checked. No one had thought to make sure I knew. What hurt most was not that plans changed. It was that no one thought my absence required explanation. My presence was no longer assumed. It was no longer necessary to confirm whether I would be there. Something inside me shifted in that moment, not loudly, not dramatically. There were no tears or raised voices. It was quieter than that. It was the realization that this was not a mistake. It was a decision, even if it was an unspoken one. After that, it kept happening. Birthdays passed with a short text message, if that. Graduations were posted online before I heard about them. Family trips appeared on social media without any mention beforehand. I learned about my own family's life the same way strangers did. Through carefully chosen photos and captions, through comments and reactions, through images that showed everyone together while I remained invisible outside the frame. Each time I asked myself whether I should say something. Each time I decided not to. I did not want to seem needy. I did not want to make anyone uncomfortable. I did not want to be the reason for tension. Silence felt safer than confrontation, even though it slowly eroded me. The pattern became predictable, plans were made, assumptions were formed, I was left out. Everyone assumed I was fine, and because I did not object, the pattern solidified. What no one noticed was the empty chair. The place at the table that used to be mine, the role I once played in holding the family together. It disappeared so gradually that it felt natural to everyone else. I still existed, I was still alive, I was still their mother. But I had become someone they thought of after everything else was decided, if they thought of me at all. That is how invisibility works. It does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, wrapped in good intentions and assumptions. It grows stronger each time no one questions it. By the time I understood what was happening, it had already become normal for them. And for me, it became something I carried alone. There is a specific kind of pain that comes from realizing you are no longer a priority in the lives of people you once centered your entire world around. It does not arrive all at once. It builds slowly, quietly, until one day you notice that you are learning about your own family's milestones the same way strangers do through a screen. After that Christmas, I tried to convince myself it had simply been bad timing. People were busy, plans changed, miscommunications happened. I told myself that the next holiday would be different, that things would naturally fall back into place if I just stayed patient and understanding. They did not. Instead, the years began stacking up, one after another, like receipts I never wanted to look at but could not throw away. There were Easter brunches I did not know existed until photos appeared online. Smiling faces. Children in pastel outfits, tables full of food I would have gladly helped prepare. No message, no call, no mention beforehand. There were 4th of July barbecues. Kids splashing in swimming pools I had never seen in backyards I had never been invited to visit. Fireworks captured mid-burst. Everyone gathered together while I sat at home watching the same holiday pass quietly. There were Thanksgiving dinners where my empty chair was not noticed, not questioned, and not mentioned. What made it harder was that no one ever said, "We didn't invite you." There was never an outright rejection. Instead, there were explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface. "We didn't think you'd want to come. We didn't want to overwhelm you. We figured you saw the post." Saw the post. That phrase stayed with me longer than it should have. The idea that seeing a picture online was somehow equal to being there, to sharing the moment, to feeling included. As if witnessing your family's life through social media was an acceptable replacement for participation. I began replaying old conversations in my head, searching for clues. I questioned my own behavior in ways I never had before. I wondered if I had become too quiet after Robert died or too sad to be around. I asked myself if my grief made others uncomfortable, if my presence reminded them of something they preferred not to think about. Then the questions grew harsher. Was I too much? Or worse, had I become so easy to ignore that I was not enough to be considered at all? I had always been the mother who showed up. I babysat when help was needed. I cooked meals for gatherings. I mailed birthday cards with handwritten notes long after everyone else switched to quick messages and emojis. I remembered details. I remembered dates. I remembered people. So when did I become optional? When did my role shift from being part of the family to being someone they assumed would be fine on her own? There was no single conversation that explained it. No moment where someone sat me down and said things had changed. It was a gradual fading, a slow removal from the center of things until I found myself standing on the edges, watching from afar. I told myself not to take it personally. I told myself this was just how life went as children grew older and built their own families. I repeated these explanations because admitting the truth felt unbearable. The truth was that I was no longer considered when plans were made. Not intentionally, perhaps, not maliciously, but consistently. And consistency matters more than intention. Each time I discovered another event after it had already happened, something chipped away inside me, my confidence. My sense of belonging, my belief that I still mattered in the ways that counted. By the time I fully acknowledged what was happening, it had already become normal for them. And for me, it became something I carried quietly, wondering how a mother could still love her family deeply while feeling invisible to them at the same time. There comes a point where silence becomes heavier than the risk of speaking. For a long time, I avoided asking questions because I was afraid of the answers, or worse, afraid there would be none. But eventually, the weight of being left out began to feel more painful than the possibility of confrontation. That year, Jessica turned 45. For most of her adult life, we had a simple tradition, just the two of us. Lunch at a quiet restaurant, a few uninterrupted hours to catch up, laugh, and talk the way we used to before schedules and responsibilities took over. It was not extravagant, but it mattered to me. It reminded me that despite everything changing, there was still a connection we both valued. so I called her to plan it. Her tone was casual, almost distracted. She sounded comfortable, like nothing was out of the ordinary. "Oh, Mom," she said, "we already celebrated. Didn't you see the pictures?" For a moment, I could not respond. My throat tightened in a way that surprised me. I had not expected that sentence to hurt as much as it did, but it landed heavier than I was prepared for. That was when my voice finally cracked. "Jessica," I said, "why does this keep happening? Why am I always the last to know? Why am I never invited anymore?" There was a pause, not a long one, but long enough to feel deliberate. She sighed before answering, the way people do when they feel put on the spot but do not believe they have done anything wrong. "Mom, you're always invited," she said. "We just don't want to burden you. You're getting older." These things can be overwhelming. I listened quietly as she spoke. Overwhelming. I thought about the things that had actually overwhelmed me over the past few years: waking up alone on holidays, eating meals meant for families by myself, pretending I was fine when no one thought to include me. Those were the moments that drained me, not birthday lunches or family gatherings. But I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. Instead, I asked one simple question. "Name one," I said quietly. "One thing you've actually invited me to this year." The line went silent. It was not the kind of silence filled with hesitation or searching for the right words. It was empty, final, the kind that answers everything without saying anything at all. She could not think of one. I did not wait for her to respond. I told her I loved her, ended the call, and sat there staring at my phone long after the screen went dark. That conversation stayed with me for days. I replayed it over and over, wondering if I had said too much or not enough. I questioned whether I had been unfair. I tried to justify her words, to see them from her perspective. But the truth was unavoidable. They believed they were being kind. They believed they were protecting me. They believed their intentions mattered more than the outcome. Intentions do not erase patterns. That conversation did not lead to change. There was no apology, no sudden effort to include me, no acknowledgement that something had gone wrong. Life continued exactly as it had before, and that was when something shifted inside me. If I could not rely on memory or feelings to validate my experience, I needed facts. I needed clarity. I needed something solid to remind myself that what I was feeling was real. That was when I decided to stop questioning my own reality. I began keeping records. After that conversation, I realized how easy it had become to doubt myself. Every time I felt hurt, I found a way to explain it away. I told myself I was being too sensitive. I told myself I was misremembering. I told myself that maybe things were not as bad as they felt. Over time, this constant self-questioning became its own kind of exhaustion. That is why I bought the calendar. At first, it felt unnecessary, even dramatic. I questioned myself as I stood in the store holding it, wondering why I needed proof of something that already hurt so deeply. But once I brought it home and hung it on the wall, it became a quiet form of clarity. I made a simple rule for myself. Every time I discovered a family event after it had already happened, I would write it down. No commentary. No emotion, just the date and what I had missed. The first few entries were spaced far apart. A birthday dinner I learned about through photos. A holiday brunch I only recognized because I saw familiar faces tagged online. A weekend trip mentioned casually in a caption. Each time I wrote one down, I felt a small twist in my chest. I told myself it was temporary, that this habit would not last long because things would surely improve. They did not. As the months turned into years, the pages filled more quickly. Ballet recitals appeared on the calendar with no warning. Graduation parties were written down after congratulatory posts went public. Family reunions earned their own dates, marked neatly in pen, discovered only after everyone had returned home. By the fourth year, this was no longer about memory. It was about survival. Writing things down stopped me from minimizing my own experience. It prevented me from pretending I was imagining patterns that clearly existed. Then came the moment that finally broke through whatever denial I had left: the lake house. Robert and I had bought that place 40 years earlier. It was meant to be a gathering spot, a place where everyone could come together. Summers on the dock, evenings watching the sunset, loud dinners and quiet mornings. It was supposed to be a shared space filled with family and memories. I found out they had gone there because David accidentally tagged the location in a photo. An entire weekend had passed. People had stayed there. Memories had been made. And I was not included. No one told me. No one asked. No one thought it might matter. A week later, I drove there alone. The house was quiet when I arrived, too quiet. I walked down to the dock where Robert and I used to sit in the evenings, our feet dangling over the edge as the sun went down. I stood there for a long time, remembering how full that place once felt. That was when something finally settled in my chest with painful clarity. They had built a life that functioned perfectly well without me. That realization did not come with anger, it came with grief. a deep, steady sadness mixed with an unexpected sense of resolve. If they could move forward without considering me, then maybe I was allowed to move forward too. I was 70 years old. I had my health. I had my savings. And I no longer had anything tying me to that town except memories that now felt heavier than comforting. Standing there on the dock, I thought about the life Robert and I once talked about, the plans we made but never followed through on. The dream that always got pushed aside because there was time later. Later never came, but maybe now it could. That thought did not erase the hurt, but it gave it direction. For the first time in years, I did not feel stuck. I felt something close to possibility, and that was the moment everything began to change. The plan that eventually saved my life did not begin with anger or desperation. It began with a dream my husband never got the chance to finish. Robert always wanted the mountains, not as a vacation destination, not as a place to visit for a few days and then return home. He wanted a life surrounded by open land and quiet mornings. He talked about clean air, slower days, and the kind of silence that feels peaceful instead of lonely. He wanted space to breathe, both physically and emotionally. Years ago, before his health began to decline, we talked about it seriously. Not in passing, but in those late-night conversations where you imagine a future that feels possible and exciting. Montana came up more than once. He liked the idea of big skies and small towns, places where people knew your name and life was not rushed. He liked the idea of community without crowds, of nature being part of everyday life rather than something you had to plan around. At the time, it felt like something we could do later. Life had other plans, jobs needed attention, children needed help, responsibilities stacked up the way they always do. There was always a reason to wait, always something that seemed more urgent. We told ourselves we had time. Then Robert got sick. The conversations about the future grew quieter. Practical concerns replaced dreams. Doctor appointments, medications, and daily adjustments became the focus. When he died, it felt as though that dream disappeared with him. I believed that chapter of our lives had closed for good. For years, I did not revisit it. But standing alone on the dock at the lake house, watching the water move the same way it always had, something shifted. The lake had been part of our shared history, but in that moment, it felt like a reminder of everything that was no longer moving forward. I realized I was not grieving only my husband anymore. I was grieving the life we had imagined but never lived. That realization was painful, but it was also clarifying. For the first time in a long while, my thoughts stopped circling around what I had lost and began moving toward what was still possible. I understood something important in that moment. I was not trying to escape my family or erase my past. I was trying to give myself a future that still had meaning. I was not running away. I was finally running toward something. That night back at home, I sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop. The house was quiet, the same familiar quiet I had learned to live with. But this time, the silence felt different. It felt like space rather than emptiness. I opened my computer and typed 2 words, Montana retirement towns. I did not hesitate. I did not overthink it. I did not tell myself it was unrealistic or irresponsible. For once, I allowed myself to explore an idea without immediately dismissing it. As I scrolled through search results, something unexpected happened. I felt engaged, curious, alive in a way I had not felt in years. Each description of small towns, mountain views, and close-knit communities felt like it was speaking directly to a part of me that had been dormant. This was not about starting over completely. It was about continuing in a direction that had been paused, not erased. It was about honoring the life Robert and I had dreamed about, even if I would be walking into it alone. For years, I had been waiting for permission, waiting for an invitation, waiting to be included. Sitting at that table, looking at the screen, I realized I did not need any of that to take the next step. The idea was simple, but it carried weight. If I stayed where I was, nothing would change. The pattern would continue. The loneliness would deepen. But if I chose movement, even quietly, something new could begin. That was the night the plan started to form, not loudly, not dramatically. Just a decision made honestly in the quiet of my own kitchen. Once the idea took shape in my mind, I knew something important had changed. This was no longer a passing thought or a moment of wishful thinking. It felt solid, real. And because of that, I understood instinctively that this was something I needed to do quietly. In the past, whenever I shared plans or hopes with my family, they were often met with delays, half-listening, or gentle dismissal. Not cruelly, but consistently. Ideas were postponed. Conversations were redirected. Eventually, I learned that speaking too soon only invited doubt, opinions, and explanations about why something might be difficult or unnecessary. So this time, I said nothing. I started researching late at night after dinner when the house was still. I read about small towns, healthcare access, weather patterns, and community programs. I took notes. I compared places carefully, not rushing but not stalling either. That was when I found Cedar Ridge. It was not flashy or trendy. It did not appear in glossy travel magazines. It was simply a town that seemed to function with intention. The population was just over 2,000 people. It was surrounded by mountains and open land. There was a senior center that actually offered activities instead of just existing on paper. A public library that hosted talks and reading groups. A farmer's market that brought people together weekly, not just for shopping, but for conversation. What struck me most was how the town described its older residents. They were not treated as an afterthought, they were part of the community's rhythm. Volunteers, mentors, neighbors, people who mattered. As I read more, something unfamiliar settled in my chest. Hope. It was quiet, cautious hope, but it was real. For years, I had not allowed myself to feel it because it felt irresponsible. Now it felt necessary. I made lists, practical ones: housing costs, medical facilities, transportation, weather. I spoke with realtors and asked questions without revealing too much about myself. I joined online community boards and read conversations instead of participating. I wanted to understand the place before committing to it. All the while, I told no one, not my daughter, not my son, not my sister. This was not punishment, it was protection. I needed this plan to exist without interference until it was strong enough to stand on its own. Once I felt certain, I contacted a realtor from the next county over to list my house. I chose someone who did not know my family and had no reason to mention the sale casually. We spoke professionally, efficiently, no sentiment. Just facts. The movers came next. I scheduled them carefully. I transferred my medical records. I opened new bank accounts. I changed mailing addresses. Each task was small on its own, but together they formed a structure that could no longer be ignored. The house sold in 3 weeks. A young couple bought it. They were expecting their first baby. They loved the garden, the sunroom, and the shelves Robert had built with his own hands. Watching them walk through the house, full of plans and excitement, felt strangely comforting. The house was not being abandoned. It was being passed forward. When I signed the papers, I felt a mix of grief and relief. It was like closing a book my family never bothered to read all the way through. The story mattered to me, even if it had stopped mattering to them. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. There was no rush of panic, no second guessing. No dramatic moment of fear. Planning in silence gave me control. It allowed me to act instead of waiting. For the first time in years, decisions were being made with me at the center, not on the margins. This was not impulsive. It was deliberate, it was earned. And once everything was in motion, there was no need for announcements or explanations. The plan had grown quietly, steadily, until it was strong enough to carry me forward on its own. All that remained was to leave. I did not leave in the middle of the night, but the departure was quiet enough that it might as well have been. There were no announcements, no conversations explaining my plans, and no expectations that anyone would notice the timing. I scheduled the move for the week after Easter. The date felt appropriate in a way I did not fully understand at the time. Easter had become just another holiday I experienced from a distance. Celebrations happened without me, stories were shared later online, and I had learned not to expect invitations. That Easter, I did not check social media. I did not need to. I already knew what I would see: smiling faces. Group photos, traditions continuing without my presence. Avoiding it felt like a small act of self-preservation. Instead, I focused on packing. I wrapped Robert's photographs carefully, taking my time with each one. I packed our wedding china, piece by piece, aware that these were not just objects but fragments of a life we had built together. I sorted through decades of belongings, dividing them into boxes labeled keep, donate, and let go. Some decisions were easy, others required long pauses and steady breathing. Letting go was not about erasing the past. It was about choosing what I could carry forward without being weighed down. The movers arrived on a Tuesday morning. They worked efficiently, loading boxes into the truck with practiced ease. By Tuesday night, the house I had lived in for 47 years stood empty. No farewell gathering, no last-minute calls. No questions about where I was going or why. When the door closed behind the movers, the silence felt different than it had before. It was not the familiar loneliness I had grown used to. It was temporary, transitional. The kind of quiet that exists between chapters. I slept that night on an air mattress in the living room. The echoes of the house were more noticeable without furniture. Every sound bounced back at me. I lay awake listening, thinking about how many versions of myself had lived within those walls. Wednesday morning, I loaded my car: clothes, photo albums, important documents, Robert's ashes. A small box of letters he had written to me over the years. Each item had a purpose. Each one had earned its place. Before leaving, I walked through every room one last time. I stood in doorways longer than necessary, letting memories surface without fighting them. I did not rush myself. There was no need to. When I finally stepped outside, I locked the door and placed the keys where the realtor had instructed. I did not look back immediately. I took a moment to steady myself, to acknowledge the weight of what I was doing. Then I got into my car. As I pulled away, there was no dramatic surge of emotion, no sudden regret. What I felt instead was a calm sense of finality. The chapter had closed cleanly. Nothing was left unresolved inside that house. The road ahead was long. The destination was unfamiliar. But for the first time in years, the direction was mine to choose. I drove away knowing that no one was expecting me to stay. And for the first time, that knowledge did not hurt. I used to believe that healing was something that happened only in quiet rooms with soft voices and carefully chosen words. I believed it required explanations, processing, and revisiting pain until it lost its sharp edges. What I learned instead was that sometimes healing happens in motion, when no one is asking anything from you and there is nothing you are expected to be. The drive to Montana took 2 days. 2 full days on the road, moving steadily away from the life I had outgrown and towards something I could not yet name. Highways stretched out in front of me, long and uninterrupted. Small towns passed by, each one carrying on without any knowledge of who I was or what I had left behind. For the first time in years, my thoughts had room to breathe. There was no schedule to keep, no one waiting for updates. No obligation to explain my choices. The road did not demand anything from me except attention. Mile after mile, the constant background tension I had been carrying began to soften. I stopped at diners along the way, the kind of places with vinyl booths and handwritten specials on the wall. Waitresses called me Hun without knowing my story, my age, or my losses. There was no performance involved, no pity. Just simple kindness offered without expectation. That mattered more than I realized at the time. I slept in roadside motels where the rooms all looked the same and nobody asked personal questions. No one recognized me. No one knew my name. No one associated me with a role I had once played. I was not someone's mother. I was not someone's inconvenience. I was simply a traveler passing through, and that felt good. There were no expectations to manage. No pretending to be fine, no checking my phone out of habit, hoping for a message that never came. Each morning, I loaded my car, took a deep breath, and continued driving. With every mile, something inside me loosened, not dramatically. Not all at once, it was subtle, like a knot slowly working itself free. I did not suddenly feel joyful. I did not feel liberated. What I felt was possibility. The road gave me time to reflect without pressure. Memories surfaced and passed without overwhelming me. I thought about Robert, about the life we had built, and about the dreams that had been postponed until there was no time left. I thought about my children, not with bitterness, but with clarity. I finally allowed myself to acknowledge how small my world had become and how quietly I had accepted it. As the landscape changed, so did my perspective. Flat stretches gave way to hills. Hills rose into mountains. The air felt different when I rolled down the window, cleaner, lighter. It reminded me that environment matters not just physically but emotionally. For years, I had stayed still, believing stability was the safest option. On that drive, I realized that staying still had been the most damaging choice of all. Movement did not erase the past, but it reminded me that the future was not fixed. By the end of the second day, fatigue settled into my bones, but it was the kind that comes from effort instead of stagnation. I was tired, but I was not drained. As the mountains began to appear in the distance, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not relief exactly, not excitement, recognition. It felt like I was approaching a place that had been waiting quietly, not demanding to be chosen, just ready if I was. The road had done its work. It had given me distance from the version of myself that felt forgotten and space to become someone new, even if I did not yet know what that looked like. And for the first time in years, I was not afraid of what came next. I arrived in Cedar Ridge late on a Friday afternoon, tired from the drive but alert in a way I had not been for years. The town sat quietly in a wide valley, surrounded by mountains that seemed to stand watch rather than intimidate. Snow still clung to the higher peaks, while wildflowers dotted the lower ground, creating a contrast that felt both grounded and hopeful. As I drove through town, nothing felt rushed. There were no blaring horns, no crowds pressing in from every direction. People moved at a human pace, stores closed early, conversations happened without urgency. It was immediately clear that this was a place where life was meant to be lived rather than endured. My cabin was at the end of a gravel road just outside the town center. It was small and simple, exactly what I had hoped for: 2 bedrooms. One bathroom, windows that looked directly out toward the mountains. Nearby, a narrow stream ran steadily, its sound constant and calming, like a reminder that things could move without chaos. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The space was empty, but it did not feel lonely. It felt open, ready. Sunlight came through the windows in a way that made the room feel warm without being overwhelming. I set my bags down and stood there for a long moment, taking it all in. This place did not ask me who I was before. It did not expect anything from me. It simply existed, offering shelter and quiet. The moving truck arrived the next morning. I spent the day unpacking slowly, deliberately. There was no pressure to finish quickly. I placed Robert's photographs on the walls one by one, giving each of them a place that felt intentional. I set his urn on the mantel, not as a reminder of loss, but as a continuation of the life we had shared. By Sunday evening, the cabin began to feel like home, not in the sense of familiarity, but in the sense of belonging. I cooked a simple meal, sat by the window, and listened to the stream outside. The silence was no longer heavy, it was supportive. Then came the knock at the door. I hesitated for a moment before answering, not out of fear, but surprise. I was not used to unexpected visitors. When I opened the door, a woman stood there with a warm smile and a container in her hands. Her name was Patricia. She was about my age, with kind eyes and an ease about her that made conversation feel natural. She introduced herself as my neighbor and handed me a container of homemade soup. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge," she said. "There's a potluck at the senior center on Thursday. No pressure, but we'd love to have you." She gave me details. A time, a place, an invitation that did not assume I would decline. I thanked her and closed the door, holding the container carefully. I stood there longer than necessary, letting the moment settle. It had been years since someone had invited me somewhere without hesitation or explanation. Years since an invitation came with clarity instead of assumptions. I felt something tighten in my throat, and for a moment I had to steady myself. This was not about soup or potlucks. It was about being considered, about being welcomed without conditions, about being seen as someone whose presence mattered. That evening, I ate dinner slowly, thinking about the difference between being included and being tolerated. The contrast was stark. Here, among strangers, there was space for me. There was openness. There was an expectation that I would show up not as a burden, but as a person. Cedar Ridge did not share my last name. No one here knew my history. And yet, this was the first place in a long time that made room for me without question. That realization settled quietly but deeply. It told me I had made the right decision, not because everything would be perfect, but because I was finally somewhere that allowed me to participate in my own life again. The change did not happen all at once. It unfolded quietly, day by day, in ways that felt ordinary at first and then slowly revealed how different my life had become. By the end of my first month in Cedar Ridge, I realized that I was no longer measuring time by what I had lost, but by what I was gaining. I attended the potluck at the senior center that Thursday. I arrived early, unsure of what to expect. Within minutes, someone asked my name. Another person pulled out a chair and told me to sit with them. No one acted as though my presence was unexpected or inconvenient. It felt natural, the way inclusion is supposed to feel. That evening led to another invitation and then another, a book club that met every other week. Volunteer shifts at the food bank, morning walks with a small group who liked to start the day together. These were not grand gestures. They were simple, consistent acts of connection. People remembered my name. They greeted me when they saw me. If I missed a meeting, someone asked where I had been, not out of obligation, but genuine curiosity. I was not tolerated, I was wanted. That distinction changed everything. I began to settle into routines that belonged to me. Mornings started with coffee by the window, watching the light move across the mountains. Afternoons were filled with small tasks and conversations that gave structure to the day. Evenings were quiet, but no longer empty. What surprised me most was how quickly this new life took shape. I had spent years believing it was too late to build something new. I thought connections required long histories or shared bloodlines. Cedar Ridge taught me otherwise. It showed me that belonging is created through presence and participation, not obligation. Back where I came from, no one noticed I was gone. There were no calls asking if I was all right, no messages checking in, no questions about why I had not been around. Days turned into weeks. 7 weeks passed. 7 weeks of unpacking boxes, learning names, sharing meals, and finding my place in a community that had no reason to care about me, yet chose to anyway. It was not that I was hiding. My phone number had not changed. My address was easily discoverable. I was not unreachable. I was simply no longer waiting. When my phone finally rang, it startled me. I had grown used to its silence. Seeing my daughter's name on the screen brought a mix of emotions I had not fully prepared for. Relief, curiosity, and a quiet sadness all at once. I let it ring for a moment before answering, giving myself time to breathe. In that pause, I understood something important. The life I had built here did not disappear because someone finally noticed my absence. It did not depend on their acknowledgement. It existed on its own, solid and real. I answered the call not as someone desperate to be included again, but as someone who already belonged somewhere, and that difference mattered. There is a difference between being missed and being noticed. I learned that difference the day my phone started ringing, not because I was lonely, but because I was gone. That afternoon, I was sitting on my porch with Patricia. The sun was low enough to soften everything it touched, turning the mountains a deeper shade of blue. We had lemonade in tall glasses, condensation gathering on the sides. A hummingbird feeder I had hung that morning was already doing its job, tiny wings flickering in and out of view. It was peaceful, not the forced kind of peace that comes from pretending you are fine, but the natural kind that settles in when nothing is being demanded of you. We talked about ordinary things, the weather, the upcoming potluck. A book she had just finished and thought I might enjoy. There was no rush to fill the silence. It existed comfortably between us. Then my phone buzzed. I looked down at the screen. Jessica, I did not reach for it. I let it ring until it stopped. A moment later, it buzzed again. I set the phone face down on the table between us. It buzzed a third time. Patricia glanced at it and then at me. She did not look concerned or judgmental, just curious. Someone persistent, she said. My daughter, I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. She's probably just noticed I haven't liked her Facebook posts lately. I expected her to laugh or make a light comment. Instead, she nodded slowly as if that explanation made sense to her. Are you going to answer? She asked. Not today, I said. The words came out without hesitation. No apology followed them, no justification. Just a simple statement, and for the first time in years, I did not feel guilty. That realization caught me off guard. Guilt had been my constant companion for so long that its absence felt unfamiliar. I had spent years worrying about being difficult, being a burden, taking up too much space. I had answered calls out of obligation, responded to messages out of habit, and stayed quiet to avoid making anyone uncomfortable. Now, sitting on that porch, I understood something clearly. The phone was not ringing because I had been missed. It was ringing because my absence had disrupted their expectations. I had been lonely for years and no one noticed. I had been excluded repeatedly and no one questioned it. I had faded into the background of their lives without protest. But once I removed myself completely, once I stopped being available by default, that was when concern appeared. That difference mattered. Patricia refilled our glasses. We watched the hummingbirds for a while longer. I felt no urgency, no pull to explain myself or reinsert myself into a life that had continued without me so easily. For years, I had been accessible without being included. Now I was unavailable, and suddenly that felt like a problem to them. The phone buzzed again. I did not move. I realized then that this was not an act of punishment or revenge. I was not trying to make anyone feel guilty. I was simply choosing to protect the peace I had built. I had worked too hard to get here, to a place where my presence was valued and my absence was noticed for the right reasons. The porch, the mountains, the quiet conversation beside me, all of it felt real in a way my old life no longer did. I did not want to interrupt that reality to step back into confusion and half acknowledgement. If they wanted to reach me, they could wait. I had waited long enough. The calls did not stop after that afternoon on the porch. If anything, they increased. My phone vibrated on the table while I cooked dinner. It buzzed again while I washed dishes. It lit up late into the evening and again the next morning. I did not answer any of them. I was not angry. I was not trying to teach anyone a lesson. I simply was not ready to re-enter a conversation that had taken 12 years to ignore me. When I finally decided to listen to the voicemails, I did so on my own terms. I sat at my kitchen table, a cup of tea beside me, the mountains visible through the window. I pressed play slowly, one message at a time. Jessica's voice came first. She sounded frantic. Not emotional in a soft way, but sharp with panic. Mom, call me back. I went by your house and strangers are living there. What's going on? I paused the message and let the words sit. Strangers were living there. That was what startled her most. Not that I might have been lonely, not that I might have needed support, but that the house, the one constant they associated with me, was no longer available. I played the next message. This isn't funny. Where are you? There was irritation in her voice now, layered over the fear. The assumption that I owed an explanation surfaced clearly. It reminded me of how often my silence had been interpreted as inconvenience rather than autonomy. David's message came next. Mom, can you please call us? Jessica says you sold the house. We're worried. His tone was calmer but still reactive. Worry arrived only after information became unavoidable. Only after a concrete change forced acknowledgement. Then came a message that surprised me. It was from my sister Helen. Claire, your kids are panicking. They're talking about calling the police. Please call someone and let them know you're alive. That one stayed with me longer than the others. Alive, as if my existence had only just become questionable, as if the absence of my physical location suddenly equaled danger when years of emotional absence had gone unnoticed. I did not call anyone back. Instead, I sent Helen a single text message. I'm fine, enjoying my retirement. Her response came almost instantly. Where are you? I stared at the screen for a moment before replying. I'm not missing, I typed. I know exactly where I am. They're the ones who couldn't find me for 12 years. The words felt honest, not cruel, not dramatic, just accurate. After that, I turned my phone off completely. For 3 days, those 3 days were quieter than the ones before, but they felt different. The silence was intentional, chosen. I went on walks. I attended a community lunch. I spent time reading on my porch and helping Patricia plant flowers along the fence. I did not spend those days worrying about what they might think or say. I did not rehearse explanations or apologies. I allowed myself to exist without being reachable. That was new. For years, I had been available without being valued. Now I was unavailable, and that boundary felt necessary rather than selfish. Turning my phone off was not about avoidance. It was about giving myself the space to decide how, and if, I wanted to be reintroduced into a conversation that had always happened without me. When I finally turned it back on, I knew things would not be the same. Something fundamental had shifted. They were aware now, not of my feelings, perhaps, but of my absence. And awareness, once forced, cannot be undone. I was calm when the screen lit up again, calm enough to see things clearly. When I finally turned my phone back on, the screen filled instantly. Notifications stacked on top of each other before I could even process them. Missed calls. Messages, voicemails. The number itself was startling, but what mattered more was where those messages came from. The family group chat, the same group chat I had quietly watched for years. The one where plans were made without directly addressing me. The one where photos appeared after events had already happened. The one where I had learned to stay silent because speaking up rarely changed anything. Now it was active in a way it had never been before. I opened it slowly, bracing myself. Jessica's message was at the top. Has anyone heard from Mom? She sold her house and nobody knows where she is. I read it twice. The wording struck me. Nobody knows where she is. Not nobody asked, not nobody checked in, just nobody knows. David replied a few minutes later. I talked to her old neighbor. She moved out 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks. Seeing it written out like that felt different than knowing it quietly to myself. 6 full weeks had passed since I left. 6 weeks of new routines, new conversations, new connections. 6 weeks of living a life that existed completely outside their awareness. Jessica responded almost immediately. 6 weeks. She's been gone 6 weeks and we're just noticing. That sentence landed harder than anything else I read. Not because it was cruel, not because it was intentional, but because it was true. I sat there staring at the screen, letting the weight of it settle. I had not disappeared suddenly. I had not vanished overnight. I had been gone long enough to build an entirely new life, and no one had noticed until a house changed hands. A cousin I rarely spoke to entered the conversation. Did anyone check with her friends? The question seemed reasonable. Logical, the kind of thing someone asks when they assume a person has a life beyond their immediate family. David replied, I don't know who her friends are. I stared at that sentence for a long time. They did not know who my friends were because they had never asked. They had not needed to. In their minds, my world had stopped expanding years ago. They assumed I existed in place, unchanged, waiting. Jessica typed again. Mom, if you're reading this, please just tell us you're okay. We love you. I felt an unexpected calm as I read it. They loved me in their own way. I did not doubt that, but love without presence had become their default. Concern arrived only when inconvenience or uncertainty forced it to the surface. They loved me quietly, from a distance, in a way that required very little of them. I thought about all the times I had been okay without being asked. All the moments I had struggled without being noticed. All the years I had accepted that dynamic because I believed it was better than nothing. Reading those messages, I finally understood something clearly. My absence was alarming because it disrupted the story they had told themselves. The story where I was always there, always fine, always available, even when ignored. This was not about fear for my safety. It was about loss of control, loss of access, loss of assumption. I did not feel angry as I read through the messages again. I felt distant, like an observer finally seeing the full picture. The group chat revealed what conversations never had. It showed how little space I had occupied in their daily awareness, even before I left. That realization did not break me. It freed me. For the first time, I saw that my pain had not been imaginary. The pattern had been real, consistent, and mutual. They had not noticed because they had not needed to. I closed the chat without responding, not out of spite, not out of fear, but because I understood now that if I chose to speak, it needed to be intentional. A few minutes later, I opened my contacts and found Jessica's name. My thumb hovered over the call button longer than I expected. I was not calling because I felt guilty. I was not calling because I felt obligated. I was calling because I was curious. curious to hear what she would say now that I was no longer where she expected me to be. I took a breath. And then I pressed call. When I finally pressed call, the phone did not ring more than once. Jessica answered immediately. Mom, oh my God, where are you? Are you okay? Her voice was shaking, not controlled, not polite. This was not the careful tone she used when she was busy or distracted. This was fear, raw and unfiltered, arriving all at once after years of absence. I listened without interrupting her. I did not rush to reassure her. I did not feel the familiar urge to soften the moment or make her comfortable. I'm in Montana, I said calmly, and I'm perfectly fine. There was a pause on the line, the kind that happens when someone is trying to rearrange reality in their head. Montana, she repeated slowly. What are you doing in Montana? Why didn't you tell anyone? I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the mountains. They were still there, solid and unmoving, indifferent to the tension on the other end of the call. That steadiness helped me stay exactly where I was emotionally. I did not raise my voice. I did not sound angry. The same reason you didn't tell me about the last 100 family gatherings, I said. I didn't want to bother you with the details. The silence that followed was different from any silence we had shared before. It was not defensive. It was not confused. It was heavy. I could almost hear the shift happening on her end, the moment when the story she had been telling herself no longer fit the facts. For years, the imbalance had worked quietly in her favor. Now it was being spoken out loud, and there was nowhere for it to hide. You sold the house, she said finally. You just left. Yes, I replied. I made a plan. I followed through. And I left. You didn't say goodbye, she said, her voice tight now, as if searching for a flaw in my decision that she could hold on to. There was no one to say goodbye to, I answered honestly. That landed harder than I expected. I did not say it to hurt her. I said it because it was true. For a long time, I had believed that explaining myself carefully would make things easier, that if I chose the right words, no one would feel accused or uncomfortable. But clarity does not come from cushioning reality, it comes from naming it. I wasn't angry when I left, I continued. I was tired and I was done waiting. She did not interrupt me this time. I waited through holidays, I said. I waited through birthdays. I waited through years where my life got smaller and quieter and no one noticed. I didn't disappear suddenly. I faded slowly right in front of you. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, uneven. Shallow, I didn't leave to punish anyone, I added. I left because I finally understood that if I stayed, nothing would change. For the first time in the conversation, she did not rush to defend herself. She did not correct me. She did not offer explanations. The fear that had pushed her to answer the phone so quickly was still there, but now it was tangled with something else. Recognition, not full understanding, not accountability. But recognition that something had gone wrong long before the day she noticed I was gone. I didn't know, she said quietly. You didn't ask, I replied just as quietly. The truth sat between us, unadorned and uncomfortable. For years, I had swallowed versions of it to keep the peace. Saying it out loud did not feel cruel. It felt necessary. I realized then how much power I had been giving away without noticing, by always explaining, always forgiving, always making myself small so others could stay comfortable. That phone call marked a shift, not because she suddenly understood everything, not because the past was repaired, but because the balance had changed. I was no longer the one trying to be heard. She was the one finally listening. Once the truth was out in the open, there was no way to gently step around it anymore. Silence had protected everyone for years, but now it had lost its usefulness. What remained was the weight of everything that had never been said. I haven't been invited to a family event in 12 years, I said evenly. 12 years of holidays, birthdays, graduations, and ordinary Sundays. All of it happened without me. Jessica responded immediately as if speed could undo what I had just said. That's not true, she said. We included you. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply asked a question. Did you, I said, tell me the last time you actually invited me, not posted pictures, not assumed I would see it online, not mentioned it after it was already over. Tell me the last time you called me and said, Mom, we want you there. The line went quiet, not the earlier kind of silence that carried tension, but a deeper one. The kind where someone is searching through memory and coming up empty. I waited. I mean, she said finally, slower now, we thought after Dad died you wanted space. Her words landed exactly where I expected them to. I was grieving my husband, Jessica, I replied. Not my family, not my children, not my grandchildren. You decided what I wanted, and then you kept giving me more and more space until there was nothing left. I paused before continuing, not to soften the message, but to make sure it was clear. You never asked me what I needed, I said. You assumed, and then you built your lives around that assumption. I could hear her crying then, not loud sobs, but quiet, contained tears. In the past, that sound would have pulled me back into my familiar role. I would have rushed to comfort her, to reassure her that everything was fine, to take responsibility for smoothing the moment over. This time, I did not. I let the silence do its work. You know what it's like, I continued, to wake up on Christmas morning and realize the day is already over for everyone else, to find out about birthdays and trips because someone tagged a photo, to feel grateful for scraps of information because no one thought to include you. She did not interrupt me. I questioned myself for years, I said. I wondered if I was too sad, too quiet, too much work to include. I wondered if I had become invisible, and instead of asking you why, I kept shrinking. Her breathing was unsteady now. I didn't want to be a burden, I added, so I became convenient to forget. That was when she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize it was that bad. That's the problem, I said gently. You didn't realize it at all. For years, I had been waiting for understanding to arrive on its own. I believed that if I stayed patient and kind, someone would eventually notice. What I learned instead was that unspoken pain is easy to ignore, especially when it allows life to continue uninterrupted. I wasn't waiting for grand gestures, I said. I was waiting for small ones, a phone call, a question, an invitation with my name on it. There was a long pause. I'm sorry, she said finally. I really am. I heard the sincerity in her voice. I did not doubt that she meant it, but sincerity did not erase the past, and apologies did not replace what had been missing. I'm not saying this to punish you, I told her. I'm saying it because I needed you to hear it, out loud, without excuses. Saying those words felt like releasing a weight I had carried for far too long. I was no longer explaining myself, I was stating facts. Facts that existed whether they were comfortable or not. For the first time, the 12 years were no longer a vague blur of disappointment. They were named, counted, acknowledged, and once something is acknowledged, it cannot be dismissed again. That was when the conversation shifted in a way neither of us could undo. Because hearing the truth is one thing, responding to it is another. There was a long pause after my apology was acknowledged. Not resolved, not forgiven, just acknowledged. The air between us felt different now, heavier, because the truth had finally been spoken, and neither of us could pretend it hadn't. Then Jessica asked a question that changed the direction of everything. Where in Montana are you? She said quietly. David and I can come see you. We can fix this. Her words were meant to sound reassuring, but something about them felt rushed, almost transactional. As if proximity alone could undo years of distance, as if showing up now could rewrite everything that had been absent before. I don't think that's a good idea, I said calmly. There was another pause, shorter this time, sharper. Her tone changed. You're our mother, she said. We have a right to know where you are. A right. That word echoed in my mind longer than anything else she had said during the call. Not concern, not care, not responsibility. A right. For most of my life, I had treated motherhood as an obligation that never expired. I had believed that being a mother meant being permanently available, permanently forgiving, permanently present, even when that presence was taken for granted. Hearing that word framed the entire conversation in a way that suddenly made everything very clear. You had 12 years to exercise that right, I said evenly. 12 years to wonder where I was on Christmas morning. 12 years to notice when my chair was empty. You don't get to claim it now. That's not fair, she snapped, the frustration finally breaking through. I let out a small, tired laugh. Not because it was funny, but because the word felt so misplaced. Fair, I said. I spent my 70th birthday alone because nobody remembered. That wasn't fair. There it was, the moment I had never allowed myself to name before. Not because I didn't remember it, but because I didn't think anyone would care to hear it. I continued before she could interrupt. I sat at my kitchen table with a cupcake I bought myself, I said. I waited all day, no calls. No messages, no cards, that's what unfair looks like. Her voice softened again, guilt rushing back in as quickly as anger had surfaced. I'm sorry, she said. I really am. We messed up. I messed up. The words came faster now. Apologies layered on top of explanations. Promises to do better. Offers to visit. Offers to call more often. I listened, but something inside me remained still. I don't want apologies, I told her. I wanted invitations. I wanted someone to notice when I wasn't there, not panic when I stopped being available. That distinction mattered more than anything else I had said. Apologies addressed the present moment. Invitations would have changed the past. I needed to feel wanted, I continued. Not remembered out of fear, not searched for because something went wrong, wanted. There was silence again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was heavy with realization. Then David's voice joined the call. Mom, he said carefully, we didn't mean for any of this to happen. I know, I replied. That's the problems. You didn't mean anything at all. You just let it happen. He started to respond, but I interrupted gently. I'm not asking you to carry guilt forever, I said. I'm asking you to understand that some lines, once crossed quietly enough, still count. They both listened. For the first time, I was not negotiating my worth. I was stating it. I'm safe, I added. I'm happy, and I'm building a life where I don't have to beg to be included. Jessica cried softly on the other end of the line. David said my name but didn't finish the sentence. I'm not disappearing, I said, but I'm also not coming back to the version of myself who waited. That was the line that could not be uncrossed. Because from that moment on, the relationship would either change honestly or remain distant truthfully. There would be no more pretending, no more shrinking, no more accepting half presence as love. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel cruel. I felt steady. And for the first time, that steadiness came from choosing myself without apology. The moment my son spoke, I understood something that had been slowly forming throughout the entire conversation. He was hearing my words, but he was not listening to what they meant. David's voice came through the phone, firm and irritated, the way it used to sound when he felt cornered. "Mom, this is ridiculous," he said. "You can't just run away from your family." I did not feel angry when he said it. I felt tired in a way that comes from realizing you are still being misunderstood, even after explaining yourself clearly. "I didn't run away, David," I said calmly. I moved forward. "There's a difference," he scoffed softly, the sound sharp through the speaker. "You didn't even tell us," he snapped. "You just disappeared." There it was again, the accusation that assumed access had always existed, that I owed constant updates simply because I was their mother. The same assumption that had allowed my absence to go unnoticed for years. "And how long did it take you to notice?" I asked. He did not answer right away. I waited. When he still did not respond, I answered for him. 7 weeks, I said. I was gone 7 weeks before anyone realized. What does that tell you? There was a pause, longer than the others. I could hear him breathing, thinking, searching for a way around the truth instead of through it. "That doesn't mean we don't care," he said finally. "We're busy, Mom, jobs, kids, responsibilities." I nodded, even though he could not see me, not in agreement, but in recognition. I had heard that explanation before. I had even used it myself years earlier. "I had those too," I replied, "and I still showed up." The words were not meant as an attack, they were simply facts. I worked, I raised children. I balanced responsibilities the way most parents do. And yet I remembered birthdays, I made phone calls, I showed up even when it was inconvenient. Silence followed, not the kind filled with anger or interruption. The kind that comes when there is nothing left to say without admitting something uncomfortable. That silence told me more than any argument could have. David was not struggling to understand my pain. He was struggling to reconcile it with the version of himself he believed in. A good son, a caring person, someone who would never intentionally hurt his mother. The problem was that intention had never been the issue. "You think this happened suddenly," I said after a moment. "Like I woke up one day and decided to leave. But this didn't start when I moved. It started years ago when I stopped being part of your lives without anyone noticing." He sighed, frustration creeping back into his voice. "You could have said something." "I did," I replied quietly. "Just not loudly. I asked questions. I waited. I hoped you'd notice." I thought about all the moments I had minimized my own feelings so they would not feel accused. All the times I told myself they were busy, that it wasn't personal, that this was just how life worked now. "What would you have done if I hadn't moved?" I asked him. If the house was still there, if I was still quietly waiting, he did not answer, because the answer was clear to both of us. Nothing would have changed. That realization settled heavily in my chest, not with anger, but with clarity. David still saw my decision as an overreaction rather than a response. He saw distance as abandonment rather than consequence. "You think I left to make a point," I said. "I didn't. I left because staying was erasing me." He tried to speak, but I continued. "For years, I adjusted myself to fit into the small space you left for me. I stopped expecting calls. I stopped assuming I'd be included. I told myself that was maturity, that was love." I paused, choosing my next words carefully. "But love doesn't require disappearing." The line went quiet again. This time I did not rush to fill it. I understood then that David still believed the problem could be solved by me returning to my old place, by resuming availability, by making things easier for everyone else again. What he did not yet understand was that I was no longer willing to do that. This was not about geography. It was not about Montana. It was not about selling a house. It was about finally acknowledging that I had been absent from their lives long before I ever left town, and until he understood that, we were not having the same conversation. After a long pause, David spoke again. His voice had lost some of its sharpness, but it carried something else now: suspicion, defensiveness, the need to protect himself from what this conversation was forcing him to confront. "So this is revenge," he said. "You're punishing us." I did not respond right away. Not because the question surprised me, but because I wanted to answer it honestly, without anger or sarcasm. I had waited too long for this conversation to waste it on reactions. "No," I said finally, "this is self-preservation." He let out a breath, as if he were preparing to argue, but I continued before he could interrupt. For a long time, I convinced myself that being left out was something I just had to accept, I said. I told myself that being patient made me loving, that not complaining made me understanding. What it actually made me was invisible. He did not respond. I didn't leave to make you feel bad, I said. I left because staying was hurting me in ways I could no longer ignore. I told him about my life now, not to prove anything, but to explain what had changed. I talked about the book club that met every other week, where people noticed when I had an opinion and waited for me to finish speaking. I told him about the hiking group that adjusted their pace so no one felt rushed or left behind. I mentioned neighbors who greeted me by name, who remembered details I had shared in passing, who asked how my week had been and meant it. People I've known for 8 weeks treat me better than my own children have in 12 years, I said quietly. The words did not come out bitter, they came out factual. David did not argue, he could not. There was nothing to refute because the comparison spoke for itself. It was not about effort or time, it was about intention. I didn't realize you felt that alone, he said after a moment. That's because you never asked, I replied, and I stopped offering. Another pause followed, heavier this time. Then he asked the question I had been expecting, the one that always appeared when parents tried to claim space they had not nurtured. What about the grandkids? He said. Don't you want to see them? The question landed softly, but it carried weight. Of course I wanted to see them. That desire had never disappeared. It lived alongside the pain, not in place of it. Of course I do, I said. Wanting something doesn't make it happen, he sighed, frustration creeping back in. They ask about you sometimes, he said. They wonder why you don't visit. I closed my eyes briefly before responding. You decided what kind of grandmother I would be, I said quietly. You decided I would be distant. You made plans without me. You set the pattern. I didn't choose that role. He started to speak, then stopped. I waited to be included, I continued. I waited to be invited. I waited for you to say, Mom, we want you here with the kids. That invitation never came. The truth was uncomfortable, and I could hear him shifting under it. This isn't about cutting anyone off, I added. It's about refusing to keep showing up where I'm not wanted. He was quiet for a long time. I didn't think you'd actually leave, he admitted. That's part of the problem, I replied. You didn't think I would do anything at all. That sentence seemed to settle something between us, not in a healing way, but in a clarifying one. David had assumed my endurance was infinite, that I would always be there, waiting, regardless of how little space I was given. I'm not trying to hurt you, I said. I'm trying to stop hurting myself. There was no immediate response. I understood then that this was not a moment of resolution. It was a moment of reckoning. David was being forced to see me not as a role, not as a fallback, but as a person with limits. And limits are uncomfortable for people who are used to having unlimited access. I hope one day you understand this, I said, even if you don't agree with it. He exhaled slowly. I need time, he said. So did I replied. I took 12 years. The line went quiet again, not with anger, not with shouting, with the sound of something breaking apart quietly so something else could exist in its place. At that point in the conversation, something shifted inside me. For years, I had begged without using words. I had waited, adjusted, and hoped. I had explained my feelings in pieces small enough not to inconvenience anyone. What I realized in that moment was that none of that had protected me. What protected me now was clarity. I'm going to live my life here, I said calmly. I'm happy, I'm settled. And for the first time in a long time, I'm somewhere I'm wanted. There was no anger in my voice, no challenge, just certainty. David reacted immediately. So that's it, he said. You're just choosing strangers over your own family. I let the question sit for a moment before answering. I didn't choose strangers, I said. I chose myself. The people here simply chose me too. That distinction mattered. For years, I continued, I kept trying to fit into whatever space you left for me. I waited for calls. I watched holidays pass. I told myself not to expect anything so I wouldn't be disappointed. That wasn't strength. That was survival. Neither of them interrupted me. I'm not doing that anymore, I said. If you truly want to be part of my life now, you'll have to figure out what that looks like. Jessica spoke softly. What does that mean? It means no more guessing, I replied. No more assumptions. No more finding out after the fact. If you want me there, you ask. If you want to talk, you call. If you want a relationship, you participate. There was a pause, and if we don't, David asked, then we stay exactly where we are, I said, honest and distant instead of close and painful. The words were firm, but they were not cruel. I was not threatening to disappear. I was explaining the conditions under which I could remain present without losing myself. This isn't about punishment, I added. It's about boundaries. Boundaries I should have set a long time ago. David exhaled sharply. You're being selfish, he said. In the past, that word would have stopped me cold. It had always been my fear, the accusation I tried hardest to avoid. But this time it landed differently. I smiled. Yes, I said, I am. The silence that followed was not explosive, it was stunned, as if neither of them had ever heard me claim that word without shame. For 71 years, I continued, I defined myself by what I gave, what I sacrificed, what I endured quietly. Being selfless didn't protect me, it erased me. No one argued with that. Being selfish now means I eat dinner with people who ask how my day was, I said. It means I make plans that include me. It means I don't sit alone waiting to be remembered. I paused, letting the weight of it settle. I'm not closing the door, I said, but I'm not standing in the doorway anymore. Jessica began to cry again, but this time I did not feel pulled toward the sound. I felt steady. I love you, she said. I know, I replied. I love you too. That doesn't mean I go back. David did not say anything else. I ended the call gently, without anger, without finality. I hung up the phone and set it face down on the table. My hands were not shaking. Patricia poured wine and handed me a glass without asking questions. We sat together on the porch as the evening cooled, the sky changing colors over the mountains. For the first time in years, I did not feel lonely. I felt grounded. The difference was simple but profound. Loneliness comes from being unseen. Peace comes from being honest about where you belong. That night, I went to bed knowing something had changed permanently. Not because my children suddenly understood everything, but because I had stopped negotiating my worth. 3 months passed after that phone call. 3 full months of quiet routines, familiar faces, and a life that no longer felt fragile. I settled deeper into Cedar Ridge, into rhythms that belonged to me. By then, my days no longer revolved around waiting for something to happen. They were already full. That Saturday morning began like any other. It was quiet, not the uneasy kind of quiet I used to dread, but the kind that feels settled. Patricia was out of town visiting her sister, so I had the cabin to myself. I made coffee, opened the windows, and let the mountain air move through the rooms. I had no plans that required rushing, no expectations. Then the doorbell rang. I froze, not because I was afraid, but because no one ever rang my doorbell without notice. People here knocked, or waved from the road, or called ahead. The sound felt intrusive in a way I hadn't experienced since leaving my old life behind. I walked slowly toward the window and looked out. They were standing on my porch, Jessica, David, their spouses. They stood close together, hands folded awkwardly, expressions tense and uncertain. They looked like people who knew they were late but hoped effort alone might make up for it. For a moment, I considered not opening the door, not out of spite, not out of fear, but because I had learned something important over the past months. Access is not owed simply because someone shows up. I stood there longer than necessary, weighing what I felt. There was no rush inside me, no obligation pulling me forward. Curiosity won. When I opened the door, I did not step forward to hug them. I did not smile automatically. I stayed where I was, grounded, letting the moment unfold without performing. Hi, Mom, Jessica said, her smile tight, rehearsed. How did you find me? I asked. The question was simple, neutral, but it shifted the air immediately. David looked down at his shoes before answering. We hired a private investigator. I let the words settle. There it was. Effort finally applied, but only after my absence disrupted their lives enough to demand action. So you spent money to track me down, I said calmly, but couldn't spend time including me. No one argued, no one denied it, no one tried to explain it away. Jessica glanced inside the cabin and then back at me. Can we come in? She asked. I considered the question carefully, not just the words, but what they represented. For decades, I had let people enter my life on default terms. This time, that was not happening. You can, I said. But we're doing this on my terms. They nodded immediately. I stepped aside and let them enter, watching as they crossed the threshold into a life they had not helped build. They moved cautiously, as if unsure of where they belonged in the space. I closed the door behind them. That sound felt final in a way that surprised me, not like closing something out, but like sealing something properly for the first time. I noticed how they took in the room, the light, the simplicity. The quiet order. This place did not look like the house I had left behind. It looked intentional. David broke the silence. This suits you, he said quietly. It does, I replied. There was no pride in my voice, no defensiveness. Just truth. Standing there, I realized something clearly. This was not a reunion. There were no embraces or tears yet, no emotional release. This was an arrival into reality, into consequences, into a version of me they had not anticipated. They had come looking for the woman who waited. She was not here, and for the first time, I did not feel the urge to explain why. They stood in my cabin quietly, looking around as if they had stepped into a life they did not recognize. And in truth, they had. This was not the version of me they remembered. This was not the house where I waited. This was not a space shaped around their schedules or convenience. This was mine. The watercolor paintings on the walls caught the morning light. They were local pieces I had bought at the farmer's market, scenes of mountains and rivers that felt familiar now. Robert's urn sat on the mantel, surrounded by wildflowers I had picked the day before. Nothing here was accidental. Every corner reflected a choice I had made for myself. Jessica's eyes lingered on the urn. Her expression softened, regret flickering across her face. I didn't know, she said quietly. I know, I replied. That's why you're standing here now. David shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped together. He looked older than I remembered. Not weaker, just worn in a way that comes from carrying responsibility without reflection. This place suits you, he said again, almost to himself. It does, I repeated. I gestured toward the table, but I did not offer coffee or seats right away, not out of rudeness but intention. This conversation did not need to be softened with hospitality. It needed honesty. I'm not the woman you left behind, I said. She doesn't exist anymore. The words hung in the air, steady and unembellished. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. Her spouse put a hand on her back, but she did not look away from me. We know we hurt you, she said. We should have done better. Apologies followed, long ones, emotional ones, words people use when guilt finally has nowhere to go. They cried, they acknowledged mistakes. They spoke about how busy life had been, how things got away from them, how they never meant for it to go this far. I listened, not because I needed the apologies, but because I wanted to see if they were capable of hearing what came next. When the room finally grew quiet, I spoke again. If we're going to have a relationship moving forward, I said, it has to be different, completely different. They nodded quickly, too quickly, so I slowed it down. I'm not moving back, I said. Montana is my home. No negotiation, no explanation. Jessica opened her mouth, then closed it again. You make the effort, I continued. Weekly calls, not when you remember. Not when something goes wrong, regular contact. David nodded. Real invitations, I said, with dates, with times, no assumptions that I'll just know. They listened closely now. No deciding what I want without asking me, I said. If you don't know, you ask, Jessica wiped her eyes. You tell the grandkids the truth, I added. Not that I disappeared, not that I didn't care, the truth. Silence followed. And if you disappear again, I said calmly, I'm done. Permanently, that was the line that changed the air in the room. Not dramatic, not threatening, final. Jessica nodded slowly. We'll do all of it, she said. I believe she meant it in that moment. Whether it would last was something only time could prove. Good, I said. You can meet the kids tomorrow. Relief flashed across their faces. But not today, I added. I have plans. Plans. The word felt strong, solid, something I had earned. They looked surprised, then uncertain, then understanding. For once, my life did not pause to accommodate their emotions. They stayed a little longer, asked a few careful questions, and then left quietly. No hugs, no dramatic goodbye. Just acknowledgement. When the door closed behind them, I did not feel shaken. I felt centered. For the first time, the rules were clear. Not rules meant to control others, but boundaries meant to protect myself. And that difference meant everything. That evening, after my children left, I did not sit in silence replaying the conversation. I did not question whether I had been too firm or too cold. I did not open my phone to see if anyone had texted yet. Instead, I picked up my jacket and went where I had already planned to be. The potluck at the senior center started at 6. When I walked in, people looked up and smiled. Someone called my name from across the room. A chair had already been saved for me. Patricia's absence was noticed, and someone asked me how she was doing. Another person asked how my week had been and waited for the answer. Not the polite version, the real one. I sat down with a full plate and joined conversations already in progress. Laughter moved easily around the table. No one needed an explanation for my presence. I belonged because I showed up, and they welcomed me because they wanted to. That mattered more than I can explain. The next day, my children brought the grandchildren over. It was awkward at first. Children sense tension even when adults try to hide it. There were pauses, uncertain smiles, small moments of hesitation, but there was also warmth, curiosity, familiarity trying to reestablish itself. I did not force closeness. I did not perform joy. I let the relationship meet me where I was now, not where it used to be. Over time, things did change. My kids started calling. They started asking instead of assuming. They started inviting me instead of informing me afterward. But here is the truth most people miss when they hear stories like this. I did not go back to my old life. I went back to Montana. I stayed where my mornings felt steady, where my name was known, where my absence was noticed for the right reasons. My family adjusted because they had to, because the version of me who waited quietly no longer existed. But my happiness did not depend on whether they followed through perfectly. It depended on the fact that I finally chose myself without asking permission. Living here taught me things I should have learned much earlier, but learning them at 72 does not make them less valuable. I learned that being alone is not the same as being lonely. Loneliness comes from being unseen. Solitude can be peaceful when it is chosen. I learned that love without effort is not enough, that good intentions do not replace presence. That family is defined by consistency, not proximity. I learned that waiting to be included teaches people they do not need to include you. And most importantly, I learned that I do not need anyone's permission to matter. My family did not abandon me when I moved away. They abandoned me one missed holiday at a time, one unasked question at a time, one assumption at a time. Moving away simply made it impossible to pretend otherwise. My name is Claire. I am 72 years old, and I finally understand that chosen family can be just as real, just as meaningful, and just as healing as the family you are born into. Choosing yourself is not selfish. Sometimes it is the only way to survive.